I need to keep reminding yourself you're not listening to Adam Gold. Paul Ihander in for Adam today. Graham Hill in producing for Victoria. Joining us to talk some college football, 17 days away from Western Carolina, NC State, but a little more than 3.5 weeks away from Tennessee and North Carolina State, which the first AP poll is out. Cory Smith of Pack Pride joining us here on the Adam Gold Show. Find him on X, R. Cory Smith, R, the capital R, Cory, C-O-R-Y. Cory, thanks for hanging out with us today. North Carolina State coming in at 24, first AP poll of the year. Hard not to avoid, already looking forward to week 2 with a number 15 showdown with Tennessee.
Yeah, definitely. You look at NC State and they come in at number 24 overall. I think that's a pretty fair place for them. We talked about this back before the 2022 season, and it was like, NC State's looked at as a number 13 team in the country. I thought that was way too high. This number, it puts you inside the AP top 25, which is only the third time this has happened since the turn of the century. Back in 2003 was the last time before the 2022 season that NC State was inside the top 25. So, it's reasonable expectations for NC State. They have a lot of players coming back, but also a lot of new faces from the transfer portal, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in just a second. But yeah, it's hard not to avoid that week 2 game because that's going to be the true proving ground, week 2 and week 4 when they go to Clemson in week 4. So those are the only teams inside the top 25 right now that NC State will face, and both of them happen to be inside the top 15 as well.
Cory Smith, editor of Pack Pride, joining us here on the Adam Gold Show. Cory, you mentioned transfers, and it's so easy for us to talk about the quarterback, obviously, in McCall, but I want to talk about the guys he's going to throw it to. And with Casey Concepcion obviously coming back, you have Noah Rogers rolling in too, but what gets ignored is the Wake Forest transfer, Wesley Grimes, who I understand has had a pretty decent opening start in the Pack uniform.
Yeah, the first two you mentioned, Casey and Noah Rogers, obviously two guys they have really high expectations for. Casey, a guy that played just about every role last season, and Robert and I said earlier this week that he felt like he's not going to, he's not going to try to move him to a different type of role. He's not going to say, hey, we've got all these new weapons and you're just going to have a reduced role or something along those lines. And Noah Rogers, a former 5-star receiver, went to Ohio State, comes back to NC State for 1 year, and everything we've heard since the start of the spring was that he's gotten progressively better. But Wesley Grimes, somebody that ran the fastest 40 time. We put it in a notebook recently. The fastest 40 time for NC State in summer workouts. Also somebody that has progressively gotten better as a receiver. You look back at his time at Wake Forest last year, and as much as those numbers were maybe a little bit underwhelming, you're wanting to go out and get a guy that caught for over 500, 800 yards, something along those lines. That would have been number 2 for NC State last year in terms of receiving. The numbers that he put up, just over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns last year. So when you're looking at a guy that can translate and somebody that's a big-time player for NC State this upcoming year, they have pretty high expectations for Wesley Grimes potentially being that that second outside receiver along with Noah Rogers, and then a guy like Dakari Collins, a former Clemson receiver that they have really high expectations for as well.
Cory Smith, editor of Pack Pride, joined us on the Adam Gold Show. Paul Ihander filling in for Adam. Cory, with all the offensive weapons that Robert Nye has in his bag of tricks this year, I feel like we're doing a disservice to Tony Gibson, defensive coordinator of the Wolfpack, by not really mentioning any of his star players. But I feel like when it comes to Tony Gibson and what you saw of his defense last year, we know he has it under control. But just to be fair, who are some of the defensive players that are standing out right now during fall camp for the Wolfpack?
Well, yeah, the obvious ones for NC State being Davin Vann, and then Aiden White are the ones that have, a lot of, I guess, kind of like that leadership quality. You're always looking for new leaders to emerge after you lose a guy like Peyton Wilson and Savion Jackson that have been there for years. Those two are two of the names we continue to hear. But guys that, we continue to hear stepping up. I mean, Brandon Cleveland stepping into that nose tackle role that CJ Clark had last year. He ends up transferring to Miami. But we know that for a guy like Brandon Cleveland, he stepped up in a big-time role down the stretch last season, was a big factor in NC State's success in the running game at the end of last season. Travali Price along the defensive line, another player that we've heard a ton about. He said that he's stepped up into that role and is trying to put on a lot of weight this offseason, but also really improved his run game, something that he saw as a struggle last season. Brandon Cisse is another big name to know at that opposite Aiden White at the corner position. And then Corey Coley is another one that came over from Maryland and is expected to be a potential there to kind of move into that rotation with Brandon Cisse. And then at the safety position, Jihad Carter, whether he plays safety or nickel, coming over from Ohio State, it sounds like he's probably going to play nickel. But he was somebody that we've heard a lot about this offseason, was the number one safety in the transfer portal last offseason, had some injuries last year with Ohio State, a former All-ACC safety at Syracuse. So the expectations are high for him to come in and take that nickel position and be a big part of what Tony Gibson wants out of his defense too.
17 days away from Western Carolina, NC State, the home opener. It's a Thursday night for the Wolfpack. Pack Pride editor Cory Smith joining us here on the Adam Gold Show. I'm Paul Ihander in for Adam today. Cory, Robert Anae, and Tony Gibson, what's this buy-in been like with all these transfers that have come in and the fact that there are expectations that Dave Doeren admits are looming over this program? What's that building of chemistry like, and is it a complete buy-in, or are we still talking work in progress with 17 days to go?
Well, on the offensive side of the football, most of these guys were here back in the spring. So there's obvious buy-in already at this point. You saw it in the spring game. A lot of the offensive pieces that we're talking about right now were here back when everything was going on back in the spring. Whereas for the defensive side of the football, a guy like DK Kaufman that we've heard a lot about at the safety spot, came in, wasn't able to be with the team back in the spring. There's a few other players that are trying to kind of build into those roles on the defensive side of the football. But and Jihad Carter being one of those that I just mentioned. But yeah, it feels like on both sides of the football, there's enough kind of mesh of the guys that are coming back. 4 starting offensive linemen back from last year, Casey Concepcion, Dakari Collins that we talked about. And then most of the running backs, with the exception of Jordan Waters and Dalen Smothers, guys that are returning, that you're expecting to be those guys. Kendrick Raphael is kind of the number 2 in that system. And then on the defensive side of the football, we talked about Davin Vann. We talked about, at the linebacker position, Caden Fordham is another name to know. Sean Brown moving from safety to linebacker. Aiden White back from last year. Brandon Cisse back from last year. A lot of these guys that are, kind of already known this system are able to work with all these transfers and get them caught up to speed just as much as Tony Gibson and Robert Anae are trying to do. So, yes, there needs to be a lot of buy-in from the transfers, but there's plenty of guys that can tell them, like, hey, look, this is how things are done, and it doesn't just have to be the coaching staff.
Final question for Cory Smith, editor of Pack Pride, joining us on the Adam Gold Show. I find it interesting. I'm not trying to take anything away from Western Carolina, but I find it interesting that both NC State and Tennessee have maybe what some fans would call a tune-up game, with Tennessee also playing Chattanooga. And Cory Smith, I might be asking you the dangerous question, but if you were Robert Anae and calling the plays in that first game against Western Carolina, do you keep the playbook kind of closed, or do you give some fans some excitement heading to that Tennessee game when they play the Catamounts on Thursday night?
Yeah, I definitely don't think you show the entire playbook, which I don't know if you can show the entire playbook in 1 week for Robert Anae. We've heard, obviously, dating back to him kind of back at BYU and then moving over to Virginia and then to Syracuse. Obviously he's kind of built the name, the mad scientist, because of the fact that he has such an extensive playbook. And I don't think the expectations are for him to show all of his cards in week 1. I think the one positive thing for NC State is, as much as, it kind of stinks that, your 2 biggest games are in the month of September, and it's like, all right, your entire season is going to be determined by those. The fact that you have so many new playmakers and you're not going to have a ton of film to go off of with a guy like Noah Rogers, with, Hollywood Smothers, with Justin Jolie that I haven't even mentioned in all of this. And then, several other pieces that are still kind of being, worked into the system. You don't have a ton of film on any of those guys in this system. So there's going to be a lot of freshness early on in the season that you wouldn't have later in the year. So I do think that helps a little bit, the fact that the playbook won't be shown completely. But there's going to be a lot of new faces and guys that are more athletic, better targets in this system, and guys that can make contested catches, which I think is huge for NC State that weren't in this system last year, that it's going to make it a completely different look, regardless of how much of the playbook you show in week one.
Salivating over the thought of college football kicking off like a fresh plate of pulled pork in the backyard barbecue. Cory Smith, editor of Pack Pride. Appreciate you, Cory. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you guys.